This time, travelers, we journey to the north, to the expanse of what was the Alaskan territories, to visit a bear cub and his mother. I present to you Sitka, the Snow Baby by Alan Chaffee. The iceberg on which Sitka and his mother had their den was drifting further and further south. It was but one of many bergs, and a small one at that. Huge, mountainous-looking islets of white blue swam all around them, sometimes bumping against one another with a roar. Seabirds screamed above their heads, and the sun glinted from the water merrily on days when it did not rain. Sitka felt that they were bound on a great adventure. Sometimes the wee white bear watched the waves that broke in white foam against the floating bergs, and nowhere could he see anything but sea and sky. Again, they floated close to shore, where the steep granite cliffs jutted in long arms between the fjords, the narrow inlets the ice had cut. In places, the cliffs were red with the cooled lava that had come pouring hot from some ancient volcano. And Mother Bear would tell Sitka how, when the world was young, the mountain peaks that lined the shore had flamed, smoked, and rumbled, and sent forth a fountain of fire and ashes, for that was the way new mountains were made. At such times, Sitka's eyes would grow round with wonder. "Will it happen again?" he asked uneasily. "Sometimes it happens even now," his mother told him. "But it is nothing to be afraid of. We won't go near." "But where does the fire come from?" he would ask. "From away inside the earth. You know it was once all hot millions of years ago, but it is cooled until we have ice and snow." Their little berg began floating down a shore covered by green forest, which crept into the very water's edge. Birds sang in the treetops, and lovely waterfalls poured over the pink limestone cliffs. It was like paradise. Tall ferns and brilliant flowers embroidered the brook banks. Mother White Bear sniffed. She could smell ripening berries. It would be worthwhile to swim ashore and have a little change from fish. Sitka was the happiest little bear in all Alaska. That day they feasted on clams and mussels and other shellfish they found among the rocks. They had juicy meadow grasses, too, and lilies with roots like onions. The days were growing longer and longer, till there were just a few hours of darkness, and all the rest was day, for it was the land of the midnight sun. In winter, Sitka's mother reminded him it was dark almost all day where they came from, so near the North Pole. Sometimes Mother Bear would lead the way along the beach till they came to a river. It began just behind the falls that shot over the cliff in rainbow-tinted spray. Along that river was a bear path beaten hard into the soft soil by the feet of hundreds of other bears, black and brown and gray, who fished every year along the bank. There the two explorers would catch salmon and leaping trout, and sometimes they found great piles of fish that had been washed ashore by spring floods. These expeditions were a bit of a risk for a polar bear, and Sitka's mother was conscious that their white coats no longer blended in with the background of white ice that Mother Nature intended them to live on. Still, they could always return to their cave on the berg to sleep. It floated so slowly that they could ramble all day on shore and swim back to it when night came, for Mother Bear could swim as fast as a motorboat when she wanted to. One thing she always avoided, and that was the settlement where men lived. When they passed a town, she would lay low, for it was not other animals she was afraid, so long as she was with Sitka to protect him, but of the men. She was, however, careful to keep out of the way of the huge brown bears that lived along the shore. One day they had smelled ripe blueberries, and she had led Sitka cautiously ashore for a taste of the fruit. It was boggy where they grew. The heavy rains had left the ground soaked with moisture, and they had to keep to the firm ground around the edge. even then, sometimes the cub would rip into a soft bit of moss and sink to his armpits in the oozy swamp or tundra before his mother could yank him out by the scruff of his neck. Here they felt the first mosquitoes Sitka had ever known, but they couldn't do much damage through his thick fur, except around his face. By and by, along came a huge brown bear, a Kodiak bear, larger than Mother White Bear. Sitka's mother promptly hid him in a thick clump of alders, but the Kodiak never even looked in their direction. He was following his nose to the blueberry bog. Now they had noticed how thick the mosquitoes were out over the bog. There were black clouds of them. Mosquitoes are the worst in the short Alaska summer than anywhere else in the whole United States because the ground is so wet and the sun so hot. The big brown bears and the little black bears that live in southern Alaska always go to the mountains for the summer to get away from the mosquitoes, because on the cool, windy mountainsides, the maddening insects cannot live. But it was a great temptation to come down sometimes and go blueberrying where the berries are thickest. This old brown bear, Sitka's mother whispered to him as they stood hiding in the alder thicket, was very likely on his way to the mountains for the 2 hot months. But first he was going to cross the bog, and the mosquitoes will eat him alive. Sitka wondered how such tiny insects could harm such a great, shaggy brute as the Kodiak bear. "Suppose we watch and find out," his mother suggested. "Yes, sir, those mosquitoes will almost eat him alive," Sitka's mother assured him. Sitka, wondering greatly, watched as the huge old Kodiak bear lumbered across the bog. Sure enough, the mosquitoes followed him in swarms. The black cloud of them hung over him, singing their horrid song. They settled black on his fur, but did him no harm. They could not reach through his hide. But there was, of course, no fur to protect his eyes and nostrils, and the insects began settling on his eyelids and on the tip of his nose, till he had to paw them off angrily. And my, how they could sting! Every time they poked their beaks into him for a drop of blood, they left a tiny drip of poison in the wound and made it burn and swell. By and by, the poor old fellow's eyelids were so swollen that he could not open his eyes to see where he was going. He just wandered around and around in the bog till he thought he never would find his way out again. He had come that way for the berries, but his lips and tongue were now so swollen from the mosquito bites that he could not even enjoy the fruit. But at last, he happened to wander near the edge of the bog. Then he heard the sound of roaring water, where a river came rushing down the mountainside to the sea. Making blindly for the sound, he plunged into an icy pool, where he could cool his fevered face. And there he stayed, just the tip of his nose above the water so he could breathe, until the swelling had gone down and he could see to go up into the mountains. Once upon a time, Sitka's mother told him, a big brown bear tried to cross the swamp, and the mosquitoes bit him till he couldn't see, and he just wandered around and around in the swamp till he starved to death. And all that time, the mosquitoes kept pricking him for the tiny drop of his blood that each one got. That is what I meant when I said they could fairly eat one alive, tiny as they are when there are so many of them. Sitka looked back wonderingly at the Kodiak bear that had such a narrow escape. He was shuffling rapidly up the mountainside. The next time the polar cub and his mother went exploring, they saw a band of men camping on the riverbank. The women and children, dressed in brightly hued calicos, were fishing and gathering berries and cooking fish over little fires. Now, fire was something that Sitka had never seen before, and it looked so pretty that he wanted to feel one. But Mother White Bear was terribly afraid of fire, because it was something she did not understand and kept him in hiding among the tall ferns. It was dangerous enough, she said, for a white bear to go into the woods at all when men were about. There were choice berries and other good things along the way to eat. They started following the river, where the rainbow trout leapt out of the water every now and again. They padded along as soundlessly as possible on their furry feet. The clouds were gathering about the peaks, throwing cool shadows over the woods. It would probably rain by and by, but they didn't mind in the least. They really enjoyed being out in the rain. At first, their way lay along the bare path where the earth had been beaten hard along the riverbank. On one side, the icy river swirled over rocks and fallen logs, or slid in smooth sheets over gold-speckled sands, for this was a land where much gold was found. On the other side of the path, rank meadow grass grew high in the moist soil, and even Sitka's mother could not see above its waving tops. The cub slipped into the soft black mud till no one would have believed when his mother fished him out that he had ever been a little white bear. In this tall grass they could hear strange rustlings, little squeals and scufflings, and Sitka wondered what could be going on in there. By and by the grass was not so tall. It was only about as high as Mother White Bear. They were on a steep slope now, where the trees had all been burned to blackened stumps, and the bunch grass grew. Suddenly, a sound of hooves thudded along the ground, and Mother White Bear drew Sitka into hiding between two granite boulders. A few minutes later, a herd of reindeer went leaping and bounding over the grass and up the mountainside. These Alaskan caribou can stand weather 60 degrees below zero. But in summer, they enjoy 3 months of feasting on the bunch grass. At last, the two bears reached a ridge where they could see ever and ever so far. They could look back along the way they had come, across the level stretch of grass, and down the river glinting in the sun. They could even see where the ocean beat against the cliffs in white foam, and beyond, where the white bergs drifted. Up here the wind was cold, and snow lay in the shady places. Then the same band of reindeer went leaping across the side of the mountain opposite, and on up the steep slopes. After them came racing men, trying to head them off and capture them. They use reindeer for both horses and cows, driving them, milking them, and using their hides to make their clothing, boats, and houses. That is, they do when they capture them. They had all passed out of sight in a twinkling, and Sitka never knew whether they caught them or not. He hoped the beautiful brown animals had escaped. But that night he found he had troubles of his own. "I do hope our iceberg doesn't drift too far away," said Mother White Bear. "We'd spend another day on the mountain if I thought it was safe to." "Let's stay," begged Sitka. The way now grew steeper, and the river grew narrower and swifter, until the bunch grass gave way to tall ferns, and the ground was soft with pretty-colored mosses. In winter, the reindeer paw the snow away with their feet and eat those mosses. Next came pale green willows and dark green spruce and cedar trees. The snow baby, sniffing their piney fragrance, rolled delightedly on the soft ground beneath them. Later, the slopes were all wet moss, into which the wee fellow sank so deep that his mother tried to lead him along the fallen tree trunks. But they were too slippery with moss, and every now and again he would slide off and have to be rescued. But then there were the finest, big, juicy berries. Blueberries, thimbleberries, fat, ripe huckleberries, tart cranberries, and a mild, sweet serviceberry. It was a paradise for bears. There were mushrooms, too, growing around the hollow logs, and Mother White Bear knew just which was safe to eat and which were poisonous. My, how she loved mushrooms! "Mother," Sitka begged, "let's stay here all the time." But she explained that the summer was very short, just July and August here in this part of the world, and soon would come ice and snow again, and they would have to go back to sea where they could fish. Besides, she preferred the sea. Sitka found it hard to imagine it ever being cold there, where the sun shone so hot. But by September, she told him, would come the long rains, and the days would grow shorter and shorter, till in midwinter it was terrifically cold on these mountains. Returning the way they had come, they found the men singing and laughing at their little cook fires. Along the river bank stood their baskets heaped with red and purple berries, and Sitka grabbed a pawful every chance he got. But Mother White Bear led him away around the camp as softly as she could walk. For safety's sake was her motto where the men were concerned. Sitka was exhausted now, and they were eager to get back to their cave in the iceberg. But the little berg, which Mother White Bear recognized by its shape, was away off behind two smaller bergs. Her first thought was to swim clear around them, but the cub was by now so tired and sleepy he began whimpering and begging her to carry him. How she longed to get back to the safety of their cave where he could sleep away the strange, sunlit night. As the bergs were drifting in the blue summer sea, there was a narrow lane of water they might swim between the two new bergs to reach their home. Well, she decided she would chance it. She was a powerful swimmer, and Sitka could cling to her tail. If only those two chunks of ice would stop drifting about so. She had swum perhaps half this narrow channel when she suddenly became aware of the walls of the ice that towered on either side were closer than when she had started. The two bergs were floating together, and the spray that dashed against their sides began to fill her eyes with mist and her ears with the sound of the surf. Sitka paddled wearily along behind her with her stub of a tail in his mouth, began to squeal that he was being drowned, for the waves were chopping right over his head. Mother White Bear redoubled her efforts, knowing that if she did not get through the channel quickly, they would surely be crushed between those two walls of ice. Anxiously, she measured the distance that lay ahead. Then, with a backward glance, she made a hasty estimate of the distance that lay behind them. Yes, they must be just about halfway through the channel. The space was narrowed till it seemed as if the icy walls must clash together before they could pass them, and the tide was all against her. Swim as she might, she could not seem to swim fast enough. How she wished now that she had taken the long, safe way around. But it was too late. But was it? If only she were headed the other way, the tide would help instead of hinder her. She glanced behind once more. To her surprise, the way was widening instead of narrowing behind them. In fact, the icy walls were drifting together in a V, and they were headed toward the point of the V. Quick as thought, she turned and began towing the tired Sitka back the way they had come. Then the ice ahead came together with a grinding roar, and the wave chop nearly strangled them. But she swam on, and the wee cub behind her, till they were out in open water. One last mighty effort, and they were safe. An instant later, the icy walls clashed again, grinding together until the channel was entirely closed. But they were safe. When Mother White Bear saw that they could not get back on their own berg, she towed Sitka around the neighboring bergs to see if they could not find a new home among them. There were, of course, tiny bergs, hardly deserving the name, but still affording them cool and comfortable shelter through the long daylight nights. But all were too steep to climb. There was nothing for it, then, but to return to shore. As she swam through the icy water, so pleasant after their hot day, she wondered where they could hide themselves in the strange brilliance of the Alaskan summer night. Nowhere along the shore, certainly, with those men encamped so near, and the excursion steamers passing every now and again. There seemed nothing for it but to return to the snowfields of the high mountains. So long as the summer lasted, there was food in plenty. Later, the salmon streams would freeze, and they would have to seek their fish from the sea. But if they headed generally northward in their wanderings along the snow-capped range, they would be back in a land better suited for their heavy furs. Polar bears are, like all bears, great wanderers. It was the first time in her life that Mother White Bear had ever visited land in summer, but once in early winter she had ranged southward over the ice pack, in which she had denned for her winter sleep. The breaking up of the pack in this spring had left her to summer on an island with Sitka's older brother, then a wee cub, though they had finally made their way back home by swimming many miles through the open sea. Tonight, as Sitka and his mother neared shore again, they were startled to hear the baying of wolves. They hid behind an up-jutting boulder just offshore and waited to see what was going to happen. Through the meadows that lay between the woods and shore came a herd of deer, and from their enormous leaps and bounds, Mother White Bear decided that it must be a matter of life and death. Behind them, the tall grass, man-high, moved here and there as if blown by a wind, but it must be something else that moved it. Then out on the rocky shore came the terror-stricken deer, and close at their heels there emerged from the concealing grasses 3 great fierce white wolves. The deer were all but exhausted now, for they stumbled as they leapt. They must have come a great distance, perhaps from the mountainsides where they browsed in summer. But the wolves gained on them, and the race was nearly done. Then the leader of the herd, raising his great antlers, leapt into the water. After him plunged the others, and away they swam, straight toward the rim of a green island that lay offshore. The wolves stopped at the water's edge, for they are not good swimmers, baying their disappointment till the fearful sound echoed and re-echoed from the tossing bergs. But were the 3 wolves to go hungry? Sitka watched with frightened eyes as the trio seated themselves in a row and howled their disappointment to the curtain of night that now began to glow in the north. There was nothing else to do but to watch the wolves and the aurora, for Mother White Bear would not venture ashore till they had gone. Never would Sitka forget the shimmering silver folds of the curtain that hung from the auroral arch, the star-strewn sky, and the midnight sun circling the horizon, glittering pink from the blue-white bergs that tossed in the purple sea. The grinding of berg on berg, the smell of seaweed, and the weird howling of the wolves, the slap, slap of the waves, comforting cold against the furry sides of the wanderers from the north, and the gurgling of the glacial salmon stream, all of these things went to make up the scene. When the silver curtain ceased to shimmer and nothing remained but the long flames of white fire that sprang from the zenith. As suddenly as they had appeared, the 3 wolves were gone, doubtless to chase rabbits for their breakfast. Mother White Bear now led the way back along the same river they had explored before. Sitka was tired and sleepy, but she would not stop for him to rest till she had him back so high on the mountainside that they could burrow into a snowbank. "Now we are safe," she told him, "and we can surely take it leisurely." Sitka drifted into dreams of catching mammoth salmon. Had Sitka and Mother White Bear but known it, they had drifted to one of the 3 great sounds of the west coast, Bristol Bay in the language of man. From this, a chain of mountains reached northeast to a branch of the Yukon, which mighty river they later followed to the sea as it skirted another mountain range. For from the bay, the air was warm and moistened by a branch of the current that crosses the ocean from Japan. They traversed many 100 miles of mountainside before they reached that river whose red salmon tempted them to follow its length. That river, cut deep by the rush of the spring ice, ran westward across the mighty land to empty into the Bering Sea, there to spread fanwise amid 1,000 wooded islands into Norton Sound. But before Sitka and his mother had traversed its length, they had skirted the sheer cliffs of foaming gorges and fought mosquitoes along miles of lake-dotted tundra. Their award was that they often could creep up on sleeping ducks or plover, who slept in countless thousands on these lakes as their clans gathered for the great migration southward for the winter. The two bears were overjoyed when at last, after weeks of untiring travel, they could see the waves breaking in white mist against the spruce dark shore. The iron mountains behind them shone rose-colored. They had feasted fat on the red and silver salmon and the grayling and the whitefish of the teeming river, and now at last the only barrier between them and the open sea was a series of sandbars and whirlpools and an excursion steamer, all to be avoided with equal care. But that is getting ahead of our story. In the spring, the parent salmon, huge silvery fish with black spots on their sides, had left the sea with its teeming food supply to swim upstream to the spawning beds. The gold seekers of '98 had often watched these agile fish swim through the rushing torrents, leaping up the waterfalls as easily and gracefully as a kitten leaps to the top of a hedge. High in the mountains, where the streams run shallow, they had laid their eggs and left their young to hatch. And now the stream was fairly alive with these salmlets, some of them only a few months old, some as much as 2 years. The spring of their 3rd year they would be large enough to go down to the sea. Mother White Bear showed Sitka a salmon laying her eggs. First the great 4-foot fish lay down in the gravel of the shallows and rounded out a nest with her side. There she left hundreds and hundreds of tough, elastic-shelled eggs, hardly half the size of peas. Before they left the eggs to their fate, the parent fish would cover them with gravel so the water could not wash them away. Out of so many, many eggs, surely enough would hatch and survive to fill the river with salmlets. Like all explorers, Sitka and his mother knew not what unexpected dangers might lie in their pathway as they turned their noses northward. But, like all explorers, they thrilled at the thought of the new scenes they might enjoy.